You're listening to the Christ Our Cornerstone podcast, a ministry of Christ Our Cornerstone Church in O'Neill, Nebraska. I'm Pastor Logan Merrick, and it's our prayer that this message strengthens your faith and draws you closer to Christ. Let's dive in.
All right. With that being said, let's dive into Jonah. Jonah is a short book. Even those who aren't familiar with the scriptures would say, I know what Jonah's about. It's the impossible tale of a whale eating a man, all that good stuff. Was it a whale? Don't know, maybe. Could have been. I actually think if with God making everything and everything obeying him, he can make a sea monster for the moment for Jonah. Does that make sense? So, gosh darn it, I said, does that make sense? My family has been making fun of me all week about that. I got to figure out something else now. But I truly think that if it wasn't a whale, there's no impossibility to it. But what you need to know is that Jesus quotes Jonah because his life foreshadows Jonah. But he's a better Jonah. Because Jonah looks a lot like me and you. And we're going to get into that in just a second. But what is Jonah about? Tell me. Don't get quiet. You guys know, what Jonah's about. Yes, sir. He lied? Yeah, good job. He got eaten by a whale because he didn't go where he was supposed to go. What else do we know about it?
He tried to run away.
Yeah, he tried to run away.
I think it's about us.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly right. Who is the central character of the book of Jonah?
The Ninevites. Jonah didn't want to have them be saved.
Right. So who's the central character? Who's it about? God. Here's why I say that. Some people would say it's about a fish. Well, fish, the word fish only is 4 times and used only 4 times in this short book. The Ninevites or that great city or Nineveh only 9 times. Jonah the prophet is only mentioned 18 times, but God is mentioned 38 times. If you eliminate God from the story, you have a story that makes no sense. You just have some weird dude that goes and gets on a boat, right, and swallowed up. And then he goes and he's pouting, right? So it makes no sense if you take God out of the central story. But what Jonah is ultimately about is it talks about the will of God and his love for the nations. But let's start from the beginning as we set this up. So who is Jonah? In 2 Kings 14:25, it tells us that Jonah ministered during the reign of King Jeroboam II. Why is that important? Because here's what you need to know. Jonah tells us nothing about himself. Why? Because he was actually really well known already. He didn't have to explain who he was because everyone already knew who he was, and here's why. If you read in 2 Kings about Jonah, it talks about him and he ministered to the royal administration. Now here's why that's important. Because Amos and Hosea, other prophets, other minor prophets, were actually very critical of the administration of Jeroboam because they were not godly. But not Jonah. Jonah was not that way. He would puff up Jeroboam. Was he a prophet? Absolutely. But here's what you need to know, and here's why I say he looks a lot like you and I. Jonah not only supported the royal administration, but Jonah loved the fact of how their military might was so strong. He loved their policy. And Jonah was intensely patriotic. Now, let me just stop for a second before anyone would get upset or offended. Myself and others in this room have served in the military here. I know all of us in this room love our country. There is nothing wrong. I believe it is an absolute blessing to live in the United States of America. Okay? The problem becomes when we begin to blur the lines between our nation is our God and our president is our God. That's called idolatry. That's not Christianity. That's called nationalism, not Christianity. You follow me? So we can very easily, and I'm talking about myself. Listen, we know where we are going in the book of Jonah, okay? So I'm skipping ahead, but we're only going to do 3 verses. But I'm going to say this. When I see videos on Facebook of people that are like Antifa and a patriot punches them in the face, I'm like, oh yeah, Daddy got what he deserved. I like that. And when I read through Jonah, preparing for this, the Lord goes, tell me about Antifa again. That stings. So when we walk through Jonah, you have to understand Jonah looks so much like us because he believes he is a Jew. He loves God. He loves the law. He loves all things that are right, but he believes that they are special and everyone else around them, including their enemies, do not deserve grace. And so as we dive into this, we've got to know that the Lord, though Jonah is about God, it's God's heart for the nations and those who don't look like us. Those that don't believe like us, those that are in the darkness and desperately need light, God is saying, go be light, don't just hate the darkness. So why does all this matter? Because this is who God chooses to call to speak repentance and grace to his biggest enemy. That's why it's so ironic. God could have called Hosea, he could have called Amos, he could have called anybody else, but he calls Jonah to go and preach repentance to his biggest enemy. People who he legitimately hates. Does God not have a sense of humor? Pretty funny, eh? And so who is his enemy? The Ninevites. Nineveh. Let's talk about Nineveh for a moment. Because if there was a reason to hate somebody, it's this. So who are they? Well, they are technically in history. This isn't Pastor Logan calling them this. This is what historians call them. They were one of the original terrorist states. Founded by Nimrod. You guys recognize that name? Old Testament. Did you know if you read about Nimrod, which I've done a lot of reading about a lot of those who are mentioned early in Genesis, Nimrod was considered not just in Scripture, but we're talking about throughout all Mediterranean history, Nimrod is known. And he's considered a titan. You guys know what a titan is? One of the great warriors of the day. He is a half-blood, meaning he comes from a line where fallen angels procreated with human women and created things called Nephilim. Nephilim being giants. You can be like, all right, Pastor Logan, you're getting into crazy stuff. I'm just telling you the Bible covers a lot of crazy stuff and a lot of supernatural things that are just insane. Actually, I spoke at the little Christian school on Wednesday, and they asked me to speak on the 2 bears that Elisha tells to come out and eat the children. They're like, will you preach on that? And I was like, can honestly say no one has ever asked me to preach on that text. And so I was like, well, it's the week of Halloween, why not? And so, but what I told him was, I was like, if you think that this story is scary, there's a lot of scary stories. And that made me go, back when I was in elementary school, my 3rd grade teacher, after lunchtime, would always read us this book called Scary Stories to Read in the Dark. It's a pretty famous, book. And I was like, you know what? There's a lot of scary stories in the Bible. I'm going to write something called Scary Stories to Read at Sunday School, because the Bible's got some creepy, scary stuff. But some of that, when it comes to Nimrod, Nimrod is strong. He's known as a hunter before God, but that is not meant to be like he is godly. That's meant to be actually a slam. Because who is Nimrod? Nimrod would kill those who would think about even trying to have other ladies in their life, because Nimrod wanted to claim all women for himself. Nimrod was a cannibal. Nimrod did a lot of bad things, and so therefore when he built Babylon and he built Nineveh. Nineveh came before Babylon. So the Ninevites, what are some of the things that they would do? Well, they were cannibals too. But they're also known as the Assyrians, by the way, in this time period. This is the Assyrians. But the Assyrians were known as the cruelest, most violent empire of ancient times. They would burn children alive. They would pull out the tongues of their enemies. They forced families to hold poles of their family members who had been decapitated and parade them through the city. And then they would kill them. They would cut off the legs and one arm of their enemies, and then as the army marched by, they would high-five them. That's kind of funny and also really sick. I mean, think about that. That takes a lot of thought. Like their mockery was so deep. And so who were they? They were pagan worshiping cannibals, and they hated everyone that was not them. And so the book of Jonah shows us that God views the Jews, he begins to judge them, and he goes, you know what, Jonah, you so don't understand me, and the rest of the Jews and the nation of Israel so don't understand me. I'm actually going to have you go and preach repentance, and I'm going to save the nation that you hate the most. So this is an indictment on the Jews. But this is also our origin story, brothers and sisters. Why do I say that? Are we not Gentiles? This is our origin story, the foreshadowing of Christ going to come and preach that Gentiles are going to be grafted in. By the way, what did God say? What did Jesus say? What did Paul say about the Gentiles? We would be a stumbling block, right? You're an Assyrian. Not from the demographic standpoint, but just from a sinful standpoint. You are a nation, and God loved you enough to graft you in. So, let's read the text. After all of that, Pastor Logan's finally into the text, and we're only going to go 3 verses. Actually, we're not even going to go all the way through verse 3. And the word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Get up, go to the great city of Nineveh, and preach against it, because their evil has come before me. So Jonah got up, but he fled to Tarshish from the Lord's presence. Now, if you remember the verse of the week, what did the verse of the week say? You guys remember? Can you pull that up for me real fast?
Where shall I go?
Yeah, where shall I go? Not even to Sheol. If I go there, where's Sheol, the place of the dead? I can go there, and you're there. I shared that because Jonah knows that God is everywhere. He's all present, and yet he still, in his complete fear and his just unwillingness, runs, trying to get away from God. Now, real quick, if you'll pull up the map for me, Dustin, please. I want to show you where Nineveh is. You see where Babylon is. No, now, Jonah is from right here where it says Gath Hefer. That's where Jonah is currently, and that's where he is from. So Nineveh is up here. And he gets on a boat in Joppa down here, and he flees to Tarshish. Tarshish isn't even on the map, right? To him, this is what's funny about it. He's going to try to flee to essentially what we know as modern day Spain. To the Jews at that time, that was the end of the world. So he was literally willing to go anywhere but over there. Now, how far is Gath Hepher to Nineveh? 500 miles. 500 miles. Imagine walking. That's like starting in Lincoln and then going to Rapid City. Walking. So when God said go, it wasn't probably just the people. It was probably even thinking, man, that is a trek by myself through the desert, me and a camel. But God calls him and he goes the opposite direction. I want you to think about this for a second. It says that great city, Nineveh. I wanted to know how big Nineveh was, so I went and started doing some research, and it lays out exactly how big Nineveh was. And I was like, because it's talking about it in biblical terminology, so I'm like, I don't know what that means. So I went and asked the wonderful ChatGPT, what is the equivalent, if this is how big this is, what is the equivalent of a U.S. city? And it came back and it said, the equivalent of this city, because Nineveh is in one big circle, it's a circumference, it would be as if New York, the entire state of New York, half of Connecticut and half of New Jersey were one city. That's how big Nineveh was. Now, think about this. Jonah is going to not only go there, and we know how wicked they were. How welcome do you think it would be for a rabbi in 1941 to go preaching to the Nazis to repent on the streets of Germany? Think that's welcomed? That's the equivalent of what he's going through. So now you kind of see when God spoke, he's like, nope, you obviously missed that. So, with all of the context that we have, that's all been set up now, let's get to the first point. The first point is this. God's call transcends our boundaries and biases. God's call transcends our boundaries and biases. God's mission doesn't stop where our comfort does. So many times, I've heard people say, I would never do that. And I always go, especially now, I always go, brother, sister, that's hilarious. Because I would have said, and my wife would have said, we were just talking about this the other day. When we first got married, and I was talking about ministry and everything, my wife, I brought up the idea of moving out of state, and she's like, no, we will never live anywhere but Florida. Do you realize how cold it is in other places? If someone would have said to us, God is going to call you to the state of Nebraska, we would have been like, not so fast. Nope, never. And God always laughs at that. And so what my spiritual mentor used to always say, never say that because God will send you there. Now, I'm not going to go that far. But I've said this before, and I'm going to say it again. There are many times where God will call you to go somewhere and you will refuse because you're like, God, do you not even know me? I'm not going to do that. That sounds awful. And the funny thing is God does know you, and he knows you so well that he's like, you have no idea how much you're going to like it. You have no idea how much you're going to enjoy it. And then other times there's going to be things just like Jonah where you still should go. You're going to hate every second of it, but it's for your own good. When I decided to go into the military to be a chaplain, I remember after the third night, I called my wife and I said, in boot camp, and I said, I've made the biggest mistake of my life. Like, this is awful. I'm like, do you realize how early they make me get up and move my body around? And I'm like, and why does every meal come with gravy? I'm Southern, and every meal should have some gravy, but not breakfast. Not brown gravy. White sausage gravy maybe, but not brown gravy. Can somebody tell me, by the way, why does every meal come with gravy in the military? It's ridiculous. Yeah, to hide the fact that everything else tastes terrible. But I'm like, this is terrible. And my wife goes, calm down. You sound crazy. Calm down. You need to go to sleep, and you need to realize, and this was so crucial to me. She goes, this isn't forever. It's just a season. And God obviously has something for you. So stick it out. Be a man. And go to bed. And that's what I did. And I made it through, ended up having a fantastic time after that when I stopped having a bad attitude and decided, you know what? There's a whole lot of stuff going on around me. I need to just accept this experience and just go do it, and ended up having a great time. But in the moment, I was like, no, sir. No, sir. And so, again, his mission does not stop where our comfort does. So if God calls you, let's just say right now, like we were just in a meeting with the missions committee, and they were talking about doing an international missions trip at some point. God's going to tell some of you to go. And your initial reaction is going to be, I didn't hear that right. I'm not doing a squatty potty. If we're going to go to Aruba and stay in a really nice hotel, and then I get to, maybe do some stuff in an orphanage for a day, that might be nice. Nah. Go get uncomfortable for Jesus. Because it's in that uncomfortableness that God does his greatest work in you. You'll see miracles. This isn't in my notes, but I want to share this because my next note is Jonah felt that this was a suicide mission with zero chance of success. One of my friends who was my manager when I worked at a grocery store years and years ago, he was a devout Southern Baptist, man. Devout Southern Baptist. And he's about 6'3" tall, and he had the tightest flat top in the world. You can land a helicopter on that thing. And he had these big glasses, and he still looks that way today. And he says to me, I show up for work one day, and he's tossing cans on a shelf, and he says, you'll never guess what I'm about to go do. And I said, what's that? He said, I signed up, our church is doing a missions trip to Mexico. And I said, cool, you going? He said, yeah, but I don't want to. And I said, why? He said, because that just sounds terrible. And he goes, I said, well, then why are you going? He goes, because my daughter wants to. And he goes, I've seen the movie Taken. Ain't nobody taking my daughter. You guys know what Taken's about, right? Girl gets kidnapped. And he goes, no. He said, I'm going and protecting my daughter. I said, how about you go and just serve people for the Lord? And he goes, nah. I'm just making sure my daughter's going to be safe. I said, okay. He comes back from this trip, and he goes, I said, how was it? He had the biggest smile on his face, and he goes, I saw miracles. Now, when I say he was deeply Southern Baptist, I mean he did not believe in miracles. And I said, what do you mean you saw miracles? He said, I'll tell you what. He said, we went into this gymnasium with all these kids, and he said, we were there to do some sort of thing, and he said, you know how you can buy Starburst in the bag and they're individually wrapped, He said he had a fanny pack just full of Starburst for himself, not to share. And he said that this one little boy comes up. I hear you over there. You're like, that's a mistake, buddy. So he said that he's in this gymnasium and he goes to pull one out and eat it. And he said, next thing he knows, he's like, all these kids just are around him. And they were just like, he goes, I don't even know what they were saying, but he's like, they just had their hands up. And I go, so what'd you do? He said, man, he's like, I'm sitting there going, I don't have enough for all these kids. He said, because they were literally, it was all the kids that filled up this entire gymnasium. He said, I don't have enough. And he's like, I'm going to feel terrible if I don't have enough for all these kids. And I said, and you're going to feel terrible because they're yours. And he was like, that's somewhat true. But he's like, and I said, so what'd you do? He said, I just went, Lord, I don't know what to do, but all I'm going to do is just reach in and I'm going to give one. I'm going to reach in and I'm going to give one. And I said, okay. And he goes, and I decided, like, I'm not going to look in my fanny pack. I'm just going to keep reaching in. I said, so what happened? He said, I kid you not. He goes, I got to the last kid and there was one left. And I said, you were like the whole 2 loaves, all that jazz, right? And he's like, exactly. And he goes, and then there was another time where we're on the street, and he said, I got really caught up in watching the street performer. And he goes, and I had no idea that the entire group had already left. And we're in down this very, big city. And he says, and I can't speak any Spanish. I had no intention to share the gospel with anybody, so I didn't bother trying to learn Spanish. He said, so when I turn around, everyone's gone, and I have no idea where anyone is. And I go, so what'd you do? He said, I went to ask this guy, like, I was trying to explain, because I didn't know the address, I was trying to explain where my hotel was. And he said, and as I opened my mouth, I began to speak in Spanish. And then he goes, and then the guy talking back to me speaking in Spanish, and I understand everything he's trying to say. He goes, I was able to get directions, get back to our hotel, and then I could not do any sort of Spanish and speak anymore ever again. And I'm like, that's a miracle, buddy. Those are miracles. He went away going, that's not the last trip I'll ever do. He's like, it changed my life. And so that's what I'm saying. We can be like Jonah and have the wrong heart and the wrong mindset about reaching other people, and God goes, you have no idea. This isn't just about them. This is about you too. And I'm going to show you some really neat things along the way. And so, why doesn't God ask Jonah if he's comfortable with his plan? Why doesn't he ask him? Because I've heard this before. God's a gentleman. He'll never ask you to do something you don't want to. I was about to say something I shouldn't, but why doesn't God ask him? If that's true, why doesn't God ask him? Jonah, are you comfortable with going to Nineveh? I mean, I can ask somebody else. It's totally cool if you don't want to. Why doesn't he? Come on.
I think he knows. He knows what's best.
Yeah. And also, it's right in front of you. He doesn't care. Jesus doesn't care about your feelings. He only wants you to be obedient. Because again, as is already stated, he knows what's best. Because, and he doesn't care, so because he wants not only to show mercy to the Ninevites, but also he's pronouncing judgment upon Jonah and the Jews. Point number 2. God's call doesn't need explanations. It comes with expectations. God's call doesn't need explanations. It comes with expectations. What do I mean by that? God doesn't have to explain himself or give you all the answers. You are expected to just trust and go. How many of you guys has God called you to do something? And it doesn't have to be some going on an international mission trip. It doesn't have to be anything big and grand. But how many times has God called you to do something and you say, well, Lord, is this all going to work out? Have you ever done that? Yeah. And does God say yes? No. He doesn't say anything. Because he's like, it's all about trust. It's all about trust. And what did I tell you guys a couple of weeks ago? To trust, the only way you can trust is by knowing. You got to know him to trust him. He's never going to give you the answer or the end. He's only going to tell you, we're going to take small steps of trust towards me. If you're in this room and you don't believe in God and you say, well, I don't believe in God because it's just blind leaps of faith. No, it's not. It's daily small steps towards Jesus of just trust. It doesn't matter how small the steps are. You just keep gaining and looking at Him. And by the time you turn around, you'll go, oh, my Lord, look how far God has brought me. It's small steps of trust. But you have to understand, when you say yes to the Lord and you say yes to His will, you better put on a seatbelt because it gets crazy. I mean, I know I joke about it and I say this stuff all the time, but I would have never, ever thought that I would be here right now. I would have never thought that my daughter would get in the car one day and go, Dad, look at all the cow goo from the calf I just birthed. And I'm just like, that's disgusting, baby, but I'm glad you enjoyed it. He didn't ask me. He just said, trust me. God doesn't have to explain Himself or give you all the answers. You're just expected to trust and go, as I said. There are times when God will call us to something that makes no logical sense, but if He calls us, we go. So my question is this. There will be times when God calls you to something. Henry Blackaby talks about this in Knowing God. Have any of you guys ever read that book, Knowing God, by Henry Blackaby? One person? Okay, cool. We're going to I think we should do that on a Wednesday night together. We'll read through the book together. It is a fantastic book on knowing the will of God for your life. But Henry Blackaby he passed away in the last 5 years. I actually had the awesome opportunity to meet him towards the end of his life. Just the most amazing godly man. But he tells this story in Knowing God where he was pastoring a church in California that was a pretty large church. And he's originally from Canada. And one day, the Lord begins to speak to him that He's going to call him to Canada. And he was like, okay, he's not opposed to it. But they were really happy in California, his family. And he has young kids at this time. And this church calls a mission church. What is a mission church? Well, it's essentially a small gathering group of people who have no money at all, may not even have a building, but I believe this church did have a building. But it was less than 10 people, elderly people, and they said, Henry, we feel like God is calling you to come here and be our pastor. And he's like, okay. And they said, here's the thing though, we have no money, we can't pay you, we can't even pay to get you here. But we believe God is calling us here, calling you here. Logically, anyone would go, that's dumb. That's not God. You've got little kids to think about. What are you going to do about insurance? How are you going to support yourself? Right? All natural things. Those are good questions. But God had already spoke to Henry, and then he gets a call. So he just says, okay, Lord. He said, they pull in to the church. He said, we don't even have any idea where we're going to sleep that night. We don't have any idea of anything. And he said, and I get it. I don't even know how this association even knows I'm in town because nobody knew. He said, but I get a call from an association that said, at the church, right as they're pulling up, and they say, Henry, we have a church in Texas that wants to give to our association. We just heard that you're in town, that you're going to pastor this church. They want to pay your salary for the next 5 years. And just crazy things like that continue to just happen to Henry all the way through. And then, now it's not, when you read Knowing God, there's other things that come up that don't exactly work out. But Henry's whole thing is, he's never going to give you the end. He's only going to just say, be present with me and trust. So my question to you is this. If God calls and when He calls, because He will, are you going to say yes? No matter what it looks like. Point number 3. This is where I'm going to kind of camp out for just a moment. Point number 3 is this. God's call exposes our rebellion and our religious hypocrisy. God's call exposes our rebellion and our religious hypocrisy. Now, what do I mean by that? So if we go back to our text, it says that Jonah heard him and went the opposite direction. When you know the story of Jonah, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, we see Jonah be both ways. He full on rejects God in rebellion, just says, nope, I want nothing to do with it. And then later on in the story, we see his religious hypocrisy play out. And so like Jonah, we can run from God. And so as I said, the first way we run from God is simply by rejecting God completely. I want nothing to do with you. You can be in this room and be somebody who just has completely rejected God fully, and God still is calling out to you to come home. But that's completely rejecting and living in rebellion. But then there's many of us in this room that are the other way. We use works and religion to keep God at a distance and ultimately be like, oh no, God, you owe me. I don't owe you anything. Does that sound like a classic story that plays out in the New Testament? Where do we see two people, two brothers to be exact, where one completely rejects and the other one gets angry? The prodigal son. So in Luke 15, we see the two sons. The younger brother tries to escape his father's control by getting his inheritance and leaving and rejecting his father and living however he wants, right? And then we have the older brother who stays and he works for his father and he does all the things that his father asks of him. And then when his brother comes back, what does the dad do, right? He meets him out, gives him a ring, puts a coat on him, does all the things and brings him back into the fold, and he weeps and he's like, you're back. I'm so happy, right? We're gonna kill a fattened calf. We're gonna have a party. Let's do this. What does the older son do? He gets angry. He's like, what are you doing? He stole from you. He left. He lived however he wanted. And you're going to welcome him back into this family. And not only welcome him back in, but you're going to give him more inheritance. That inheritance is mine. What are you doing? I've stayed here. I've done everything you asked of me. And you're going to give him what's mine? What does that sound like? That sounds like my prayer time. What do you mean you're just going to allow this murderer to come into the kingdom on his deathbed? I've served you my entire life. My family has done ministry for 20 years. Financially, we've been in poverty. I've done everything for you. I've always said yes. You owe me. I don't owe you. Yeah, I've said that. Both ways are rebellious. Both ways are sinful. Flannery O'Connor, she's a Catholic woman who wrote some incredible thriller books, but they have like Christian themes to them. But Flannery O'Connor says this: the way we avoid Jesus is to avoid sin. Catch that? The way we avoid Jesus is to avoid sin. What is she saying? What do you think she's trying to say?
We don't have to repent. We don't need him.
Yeah. You want to be able to control. If you didn't hear what my wife said, if you don't have to repent, you don't need Jesus. And she's meaning that in a negative way. Right? We know we can't get Jesus, or we can't get to heaven through works. And so what we do is we lie to ourselves and go, I'm going to live this moral life. I'm going to be very works-based. I'm going to do all the things correctly. And I'm going to believe that God ultimately should be the one blessing me. And I am not beholden to him at all. And he will never ask me to do anything that's uncomfortable because I've done all the things and checked all the boxes.
We don't want to be convicted.
Yeah.
We don't want to feel convicted.
We don't want to feel convicted. We also don't want God to ask us to do anything. It's ultimately, if you're a football fan, it's the ultimate stiff arm to God. You stay over there, and when I need something, I'll let you know. And so what I put in here, meaning, we truly believe that if we are good, religiously observant, and virtuous, then we have paid our dues. Now God can't ask anything. Matter of fact, He owes us. He's obligated to do our bidding, not the other way around. And so again, both are rebellious. Just one is more allowed in the church than the other. So we, like Jonah, want a God of our own making. We want Him to smite people we don't like, bless us continually, and require nothing of us. But this is not the God of the Bible. He is just and He is merciful. And when He calls, we should answer because He's worth it.